Imagine for a second, right, that you could discover a single unified mathematical equation. And this equation just perfectly predicts 2,000 years of human history.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, not just like the broad strokes, but the exact years. So the rise of the Roman Catholic Church, the invention of the printing press, the specific year the first televised megachurch sermon was broadcast to millions.
Right, the really massive milestones.
Exactly. What if none of those were historical accidents? What if they were all scheduled down to the exact year by a ticking two-millennial-old clock?
I mean, it completely upends how we normally view the past. We are so used to seeing history as this chaotic, unpredictable ocean of overlapping empires and random technological shifts. But the framework we're looking at today, it removes that chaos entirely.
It really does. So welcome to the deep dive. Today, our mission is to explore a highly intricate, honestly heavily mathematical framework. And in our sources, this is known as the forensic prophetic model.
Yeah, that's the title they use.
Now, whether you are a history buff, a theology student, or honestly just someone who loves that incredibly satisfying feeling when a massive mountain of chaotic data suddenly snaps into a perfect pattern, this model is designed to give you a massive aha moment.
It's very satisfying to look at structurally.
It is. We have a huge stack of sources today. This includes a very detailed schematic timeline plus several foundational texts. And they claim to map the entire history of the Christian church, like all 2,000 years of it, to specific interlocking mathematical gears.
But before we get into the mechanics of those gears, we really need to set some clear rules of engagement for this deep dive because, the sources we are analyzing, they contain very specific, very bold theological and historical claims.
Extremely bold.
Yeah. They include detailed prophetic interpretations and, honestly, some incredibly harsh judgments on various historical eras and modern institutions. So our goal today isn't to take a side.
Right. We certainly aren't here to endorse the theology or validate the math as objective truth.
Exactly. We aren't theologians or mathematicians passing judgment here. Instead, we are going to impartially reverse engineer the author's model. We want to examine exactly how the math, the history, and the scripture are woven together to create this massive narrative.
We're popping the hood to look at the internal logic of the machine.
You got it. We are just looking at how the engine runs.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because to understand how this model ends, and believe me, it ends with a very specific, very loud ticking clock, we really have to understand how it begins.
Right, the starting line.
Yes, the central mainspring that drives the entire machine. According to the timeline in our sources, the whole model is anchored at one highly specific date, which is 33 AD. They call this the resurrection trigger.
Yes, the 33 AD anchor is basically the foundational premise of the whole thing. But, and this is interesting, before we even move forward from that date, we actually have to look slightly backward.
Backward.
Yeah, the author explicitly notes this crucial 3-year margin just prior to the trigger. They highlight the period between 30 AD, which marks the beginning of the historical ministry of Jesus, and 33 AD, the resurrection.
The author calls this the breathing room of the entire timeline, which is, I don't know, it's an interesting way to phrase it. Why does a mathematical model need breathing room?
Well, the logic here is that there's a fundamental difference between the word being merely spoken and the word being actively triggered, or like activated through the formation of the early church.
Oh, I see.
Think of the period from 30 to 33 AD as potential energy. It's like a coiled spring.
Like winding up a toy car.
Exactly. The message is being delivered, but the historical and spiritual mechanism hasn't been released yet. Once that 33 AD trigger is pulled, that potential energy turns into kinetic energy. The mathematical gears actually begin to turn.
And let's talk about those gears, because these aren't just arbitrary spans of time that the author, pulled out of thin air to make the history fit.
No, they are very specifically sourced.
Right. The model operates on two specific alternating historical gears, and they are both derived from ancient texts. The first is a short gear, which is a 70-year generation. The author bases this directly on Psalm 90, verse 10, which defines the standard lifespan of a generation as 70 years.
And then you have the long gear. This is a much longer 483-year cycle.
Now, where does that hyper-specific number come from?
The framework derives this from the book of Daniel, specifically the famous prophecy of the 70 winds. In prophetic mathematics, a week represents a period of 7 years.
So if we do the math on that.
Right. Daniel's prophecy specifically isolates a period of 69 weeks until a major historical pivot. So you take 69 weeks, multiply it by 7 years per week, and you get exactly 483 years.
Wow. Okay.
The author is taking this ancient apocalyptic math and applying it directly to the timeline of human history. So you have this short 70-year gear and this massive 483-year gear, and they essentially trade off. They alternate to move history forward.
And the very first movement of this machine, the first church era, which the model aligns with the Church of Ephesus from the book of Revelation, it spans exactly one of those short 70-year gears.
From the trigger point.
Yeah, from that kinetic trigger in 33 AD directly to 103 AD.
And during the 70-year span, the sources characterize the era as the time of the first love.
The pure startup phase.
Precisely. This is the era of the original apostles traveling, preaching on distant shores. It includes John the Apostle exiled on the island of Patmos. It represents the finalizing of the seal of Revelation.
So it's very active.
Very active. The faith is decentralized, it's grassroots, and it's moving rapidly.
If we picture this model as a giant, complex Swiss watch, that 33 AD to 103 AD block, that 70-year span, is the mainspring. It's the tightly coiled origin of the energy.
That's a great visual.
But then the source text refers to 103 AD as a massive stress test for the author's entire theory. The author hangs an immense amount of weight on this specific year.
Oh.
Why is 103 AD so critical? Because, history is rarely neat enough to just snap off perfectly at a round number. Is there hard historical consensus that the apostolic era definitively ended in 103 AD? Or is the author just, reverse engineering the history to make their 70-year math work?
That is exactly the friction point the author addresses. What's fascinating here is how the model uses historical milestones as forensic proof. The year 103 AD roughly marks the end of the apostolic era because of a specific event.
Which is?
The death of John the Elder, the last of the original eyewitnesses. With his passing, the model notes that the first love cools. The pure original movement begins its very first stages of institutionalization.
Ah, I see.
Bishops start taking more rigid control. The fluid movement becomes structured.
So the nature of the movement fundamentally shifts.
It does. But the crucial part for the author isn't just the historical shift, it's the mathematical alignment. 103 AD is precisely 70 years after the 33 AD trigger.
Right.
Because the death of the last apostle lands perfectly on the conclusion of that mathematical gear, the author views this as an undeniable forensic confirmation.
It's like the math validates the history and the history validates the math.
Exactly.
So if 33 to 103 AD is the mainspring, then 103 AD is the exact moment that spring catches the first massive, slow-turning gear of history. The energy shifts from the fast, chaotic movement of the apostles to the slow, grinding turn of institutional history.
That's a perfect way to visualize it, and that precision is what gives the author the confidence to map out the next 2 millennia. The assumption is that if the first gear meshes perfectly, the rest of the machine must also be running on the same divine clockwork.
If you've ever tried to organize a massive, complex project like building a piece of software or even just putting together a 1,000-piece jigsaw puzzle, you know that feeling.
Oh, yeah.
When the first foundational pieces lock into place perfectly, you suddenly trust the process. That's the psychological weight this 103 AD anchor holds for the author. It's the moment they realize, oh, this isn't just random human history. There is an engineered pattern here.
And once that pattern is established, the scope of the deep dive expands dramatically. Because with the apostolic era closed at 103 AD, the framework categorizes the sweeping, honestly, often brutal centuries of early and medieval history.
And it does this by shifting gears.
Right. It shifts from that short 70-year gear to the massive 483-year cycle.
Okay, let's get into the second church era, which the model aligns with Smyrna. This runs from 103 AD all the way to 586 AD.
That is an incredibly long stretch of time.
Exactly, 483 years.
Yeah.
The model defines this as the persecuted era. The source image notes the 10 days, which the framework interprets as 10 major persecution waves. We're talking about the historical fires of Rome emperors like Nero and Diocletian, actively trying to extinguish the movement.
But the defining characteristic of the Smyrna gear isn't just that they were persecuted, it's how the era ends.
How so?
The text notes that this 483-year cycle concludes not with the destruction of the church, but with assimilation.
Oh.
Yeah, it ends with the legalization of the faith, state absorption, and an officially stamped Roman eagle.
Wow. So the persecuted grassroots movement survives, but in doing so, it becomes intertwined with the very Roman state that was literally trying to kill it.
Which sets up the next gear perfectly. The model shifts back to the short 70-year gear for the third church, Pergamum.
Okay, so a short cycle now.
Yes. This spans from 586 AD to 656 AD. Now, the author characterizes this concentrated 70-year pivot very harshly. They call it the marriage to the state or Satan's seat.
Satan's seat is a heavy label.
It really is.
What exactly is happening historically between 586 and 656 AD that warrants that kind of intense imagery?
This is the era where the church officially takes worldly political power in the vacuum left by the fallen Western Roman Empire.
Because Rome had collapsed.
Right. Rome collapsed, Europe was fragmenting, and the institution of the church stepped up to become not just a spiritual guide, but a literal political sovereign.
They became the state.
Yes. They began fielding armies, crowning kings, and acting as a global state power. In the logic of the model, this is a catastrophic spiritual compromise. The church traded the pure written word for earthly authority.
And that political transformation kicks off what the model views as the absolute darkest period in the timeline. The Fourth Church, Thyatira.
Back to the long gear.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We shift back to the massive 483-year gear running from 656 AD to 1139 AD. The model calls this the Dark Ages peak and the political wrap.
The visual for this is wild.
I really want to talk about the visual provided in our sources here because it's incredibly striking. The word system is literally depicted holding absolute power over the earth. It's drawn as a heavy blanket wrapping completely around the globe.
It's the ultimate visualization of institutional monopoly. During this nearly 500-year span, the text explicitly states that the word is hidden. The institutional wrap is just suffocating.
Imagine living in that era. You don't have access to the original texts. Literacy is incredibly low, and even if you could read...
Texts are locked away.
Right, they are in a language you don't speak, guarded by a political system that dictates exactly what you are allowed to believe. It's a complete inversion of the Ephesus era.
It really is the opposite of that grassroots movement.
The decentralized, fast-moving faith of the apostles has been replaced by a massive, unavoidable bureaucracy.
And that bureaucracy brings us to the Fifth Church, Sardis. This era runs from 1139 AD to 1474 AD.
Okay.
The model calls this the Dead Church. But this is where we really need to look closely at the math, because the mechanism changes here.
Wait, hold on. Let's look at these numbers.
Yeah.
We ended Thyatira at 1139 AD.
Right.
If the model strictly alternates between 70-year gears and 483-year gears, Sardis should be a 70-year gear, ending in 1209.
Yes, mathematically it should.
But you just said it ends in 1474. That's a 335-year gap. The timeline is accelerating, but it's not using the established gears. The sources say it adds 270 years and then adds a final 65-year gap to land exactly on 1474.
Yep.
I have to call a timeout here. That's not a gear. That's a fudge factor.
It does look like one.
I mean, if the author is just arbitrarily adding 270 and then 65 to make the math land on a specific historical date, doesn't that break the entire premise of the perfect clockwork?
That is a phenomenal catch. And honestly, it's exactly the kind of critical pushback this model invites.
Right, because the rules changed.
But if we look at how the author justifies this, they don't hide the anomaly, they highlight it.
Oh, they do?
Yeah. The author frames this not as a broken gear, but as an intentional divine acceleration. The text describes Sardis as a bridging mechanism, an agonizing transition out of the deep dark ages.
So it's like the system was stuck.
Essentially. The internal logic is that the dead church was so spiritually bankrupt that the timeline had to be mathematically fractured to bridge the gap toward a coming restoration.
So, the argument is that the system had become so heavy, so monolithic, that the normal 70-year gear just wasn't enough to break its gravitational pull.
Exactly. It required a custom mathematical sequence to pull history forward to the next major pivot.
Well, stepping back from the math for a second, it's wild how the model views this entire millennium. It breezes through centuries of complex human history with one overarching theme: institutional power is inherently negative.
It really is the core thesis of the middle of this timeline.
I keep thinking of it like a modern business cycle.
How do you mean?
Well, imagine a tiny, disruptive, grassroots startup. It has passion, it has the first love, it's changing people's lives on the ground level. But over centuries, it grows.
It gets corporate.
Exactly. It's a board of directors, it acquires competitors, it merges with the state, and eventually it just becomes this monolithic, dead corporation. It exists mostly to sustain its own market share.
It's a perfect analogy.
How does the imagery in the sources support that view of the church?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the entire visual language of the source material is designed to contrast spiritual purity with institutional weight.
Like the heavy wrap.
Exactly. As you mentioned, the depiction of the system wrapping around the earth is intentionally oppressive. The model equates the marriage of the church and the state, which began back in that 70-year Pergamum gear, as a state of complete spiritual bankruptcy.
The heavier it gets, the worse it is.
Yes. The heavier the system gets, the further it drifts from the pure faith of the apostles. The institution is seen not as a protector of the faith, but as a vault that locks it away from the people.
Which is a cycle we see today in other areas. Think about how you interact with massive tech monopolies or media conglomerates.
Oh, absolutely.
They start out offering a free, revolutionary service, and over time, they build walled gardens. They trap your data, they control the algorithm, and they dictate what you can and cannot see.
They become gatekeepers.
Right. The forensic prophetic model is arguing that this exact process of institutional gatekeeping happened to human faith over a millennium.
But institutions, no matter how massive or powerful, are always vulnerable to one thing: shifts in technology and communication.
Oh, yes.
And that brings us to the next massive turning point in the model's timeline. After centuries of the hidden word under the grip of the system, those bridging years finally hit the year 1474, and the entire paradigm shifts.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because 1474 isn't just a convenient mathematical endpoint. It marks a highly specific, world-altering event.
The printing press.
Specifically the printing of the first English book by William Caxton's press. Suddenly, the word isn't locked away in a vault by the system anymore. It is quite literally printed and given back to the common man.
And mathematically, this technological trigger launches the Sixth Church, Philadelphia.
Which is a long gear, right?
Yes. This era runs from 1474 AD all the way to 1957 AD. It is another massive 483-year cycle.
The model draws heavily on Revelation 3, verses 7 through 13 here. It describes the Church of Philadelphia as having little strength but keeping the word. It's known in this framework as the missionary age.
And it's defined by sacrifice.
Right, by what the text calls an open door of global expansion for the gospel. And most importantly, it's defined by a complete rejection of massive corporate wealth and power.
And this is where the model is actually incredibly nuanced in its historical critique. The group with little strength, meaning they don't have the backing of a massive political system. They don't have the Roman eagle stamped on their passport.
They're the ones who do the work.
Exactly. They're the ones who achieve a 500-year global expansion.
I love the irony here. They do it purely through the democratization of information. It's not a king or a conquering army or a papal decree that shifts the era. It's a printing press. It's a piece of machinery.
This is a crucial insight into the author's mindset. The forensic prophetic model isn't just tracking the spiritual eras of a religion, it's tracking the actual medium of the message.
The medium itself.
Think about it. During the Thyatira era, the Dark Ages, the medium was entirely controlled by the state system. The institution was the medium.
Right.
But in the Philadelphia era, the medium becomes the written word.
It becomes decentralized.
Exactly. It is accessible to anyone who can read. You no longer need a priest to intermediate between you and the divine and the dawn. You just need a book.
It's direct access.
Yes. The source text deeply reveres this era for its humility and its faithfulness to the text itself, free from the heavy wrap of the worldly system.
Think about how revolutionary that is. It changes human psychology.
Completely.
Instead of learning communally by looking at stained glass windows while someone else tells you what they mean, you are sitting alone with a text, interpreting it directly.
You're engaged.
The power shifts from the central authority back to the individual. But we know from history and from the relentless gears of this model that nothing stays static forever.
No, the gears keep turning.
If the printing press was the technological trigger that opened the door in 1474, what closed it? Because the deep dive now transitions to what is easily the most surprising and honestly the most specific claim in the entire source material.
Yes.
The exact moment the Philadelphia era ended and the final era began.
The model claims that the 483-year cycle of the open door concluded precisely in the year 1957.
1957.
And the way the author arrived at this date is absolutely fascinating. The source text describes a sudden hit of realization, an almost visceral forensic revelation.
Like an epiphany.
Exactly. And it didn't occur while the author was poring over ancient scrolls or translating Greek in a library somewhere.
Where did it happen?
It happened while they were casually watching a Facebook video of a Billy Graham sermon.
Right. The author states that 1957 is the exact start of the final 70-year gear, representing the Seventh Church, Laodicea.
Yes.
And 1957 perfectly aligns with Billy Graham's massive New York City crusade. This event was broadcast on the ABC network to roughly 96 million people.
96 million. Think about that scale.
The model points to this specific moment as the birth of televangelism and a massive structural shift away from the decentralized written word and into what the author specifically calls the visual system grid.
And the model maps this historical pivot directly to the Laodicean church, which is famously described in the book of Revelation as lukewarm.
Lukewarm.
Yeah, a church that boasts, "I am rich and increased with goods and have need of nothing."
Okay, I have to stop and push back here.
Yeah.
Because this feels totally counterintuitive at first glance.
It definitely does.
If you look at mainstream history, Billy Graham is widely viewed as the absolute peak of modern evangelism. He is the ultimate success story.
Universally respected.
Right, he reached millions of people, counseled presidents, and filled massive stadiums. But this model views the 1957 televised crusade as a distinctly negative pivot point.
Highly negative.
It sees it as the birth of the megachurch and the return of the system god. How does the author justify turning such a celebrated, globally respected figure into the marker for a spiritually bankrupt era?
It requires us to deeply unpack the psychology of the author's discovery and the strict internal logic of the model regarding media.
Okay, break that down for me.
The author explicitly notes that they weren't trying to force history to fit their math. They describe the pieces presenting themselves almost effortlessly. When the author looked at the 1957 crusade, they didn't see the triumph of the gospel, they saw the triumph of the medium. The phrase visual system grid is the key.
Because the medium dictates the structure.
Exactly. The model argues that the moment you put faith on television, broadcasting it to 96 million people, it inherently becomes corporate.
It has to be.
Right. It requires massive infrastructure. You need lighting, sound engineers, broadcast rights, massive amounts of money, and crucially, it becomes reliant on audience numbers and metrics.
It ceases to be a movement. It becomes a production.
Yes. It mirrors the old Roman state system of the Thyatira era, just with modern technology.
That is a wild parallel.
The model argues that this visual, massive-scale medium strips away the humble individual sacrifice of the Philadelphia era. The decentralized open door of the written word was slammed shut and replaced by the centralized spectacle of the screen.
Think about how you consume media today. You've likely felt the profound difference between reading a dense book quietly in your room, which forces you to engage actively, to think, to pause, and reflect.
It takes effort.
Right, compared to being overwhelmed by a massive, flashy media broadcast, or a doom-scrolling algorithm where the information just washes over you passively.
You're just receiving it.
The model is suggesting that this shift in the medium literally changed the very nature of the faith being preached. It went from a personal text-based conviction to a mass-produced, consumable visual product.
And that transition to a mass-produced product leads directly to the next critical component of the model, because the shift in the medium, from text to television, was accompanied by what the author identifies as a massive shift in the message itself.
The message had to change to fit the screen.
Exactly. The visual grid required a theology that fit its corporate structure. This leads to what the source text calls a doctrinal glitch.
Yes, the glitch. And this is where the theological claims of the sources get incredibly specific.
Very specific.
The author notes that while watching that video of Billy Graham from 1957, they caught a specific doctrinal claim being preached to the masses. The claim was simply, Jesus is God.
Just those 3 words.
Now, to almost anyone listening, that sounds like standard Orthodox theology.
It's what most churches teach.
But the author says their spirit caught it immediately. The model argues vehemently that the true original doctrine is that Jesus is the Son of God, distinct from the Father.
Right. The author draws a massive, immovable line in the sand between Jesus is God and Jesus is the Son of God.
Hold on, let's make sure we get this right, because this is a massive theological hair to split, and the author is hanging the entire downfall of the modern church on it.
It is the linchpin of their critique.
Walk me through the exact mechanics of this. Why does saying Jesus is God completely break the author's system? How does semantics lead to institutional rot?
To understand this, we have to look at how the author views power structures. The argument is that the modern televised church teaches a version of Jesus that turns him into part of a corporate, systemic Godhead.
Like a board of directors.
Basically, yeah. If Jesus is God, he's the CEO of the universe. He is a systemic figurehead of absolute authority.
I see.
But if Jesus is the Son of God, it implies a relational, hierarchical submission. A son is an heir, someone who operates in relationship to a father, not a monolithic corporate entity.
So the author is saying that a massive institution actually needs a monolithic God to justify its own monolithic structure.
Exactly. The system requires a version of faith that sustains its own power and wealth.
That makes sense within the framework.
And this explains a very famous piece of imagery from the book of Revelation that the author uses, Revelation 3:20, where Jesus says, "Behold, I stand at the door and knock."
The author points out that Jesus is standing outside the door of the Laodicean church. He isn't inside. Why is he outside?
Because the model posits that the true identity of Jesus, the relational son, has been pushed out by the institution. By altering his nature to fit a massive systemic corporate theology, the institution has essentially replaced him with earthly influence. The church became rich, famous, and televised, but the actual core of the faith was locked outside.
So for the author, this wasn't just a minor theological debate for academics to argue about in a seminary. It was the crucial piece of evidence.
It proved the corruption.
It was the exact gear that turned the entire 70-year model from 1957 onward. Think of it like finding a single line of bad code deep in a massive software program and suddenly realizing, oh, this is why the entire system has been crashing for decades.
Yes. The author sees this doctrinal glitch as the root cause of the modern church's lukewarm corporate state.
This raises such an important question about how we view the relationship between truth and power.
It really does.
The source text inextricably links incorrect doctrine directly to institutional rot. By making Jesus into a corporate system figurehead rather than adhering strictly to the decentralized written word, the Laodicean church became rich in goods but entirely bankrupt in spirit.
And again, regardless of whether you agree with the specific theology, we are observing the internal airtight logic of the model here.
It's remarkably consistent.
Flawlessly consistent. It connects a 1957 TV broadcast, a shift in media consumption, and a highly specific theological critique into one unified mathematical theory of historical decline.
It's a perfectly closed loop. The math, the history, the media theory, and the scripture all reinforce each other in the author's mind.
But a clockwork machine doesn't just run indefinitely.
Right. If it has gears and it has a starting point anchored in 33 AD, it has to have an end point. The tension has to release.
And with all the pieces in place, the math of the forensic prophetic model points inexorably to the present day.
To right now.
And to a very fast-approaching conclusion.
This is where the tone of the source material shifts dramatically, isn't it?
Oh, completely. It moves from being an intricate, almost academic historical analysis to an urgent, uncompromising warning.
Because the math is undeniable within the framework of the model.
Yeah.
Let's do the math. 1957 is the start of the final 70-year gear, the Laodicean generation.
Right.
1957 plus 70 years places the absolute conclusion of this timeline in the years 2027 and 2028.
We are right there.
We are currently sitting at the very end of this final cycle. The gear is grinding to a halt.
The author describes this realization as deeply overwhelming. The source text claims that a lifetime of information is rapidly compressing into a very short window of discovery.
The feeling conveyed isn't one of casual interest anymore.
Not at all. It's a frantic realization that time is literally running out.
Which leads to what the author issues as a final commandment. The language in the sources becomes incredibly stark here. It says the time for playing church is over.
It's no longer about passively attending a service or watching a flashy broadcast or debating theology.
Listeners are given a direct, non-negotiable ultimatum. They must repent and be baptized by both water and spirit. The author cites John 3, verses 3 through 7 as a strict requirement for entry into heaven.
And intertwined with that requirement for baptism is a dire, specific warning regarding the system we've been tracking for 2,000 years.
It's the warning.
The author insists that individuals must physically and spiritually disconnect from the institutional corporate church.
Get out of the system.
Yes. The model claims that the system is currently in the process of selecting its second beast.
The second beast. That is heavy apocalyptic imagery. It sounds like something out of a sci-fi movie about AI taking over.
It is intense imagery, but it fits perfectly with the model's view of institutionalization.
How so?
The author is warning that those who remain comfortable within the wealth and the structure of the institutional church, the lukewarm Laodiceans who enjoy the visual system, grid will face ultimate judgment.
The text specifically references Matthew 7.23, right?
Yes, warning that those tied to the system will hear the words, "I never knew you." Depart from me, ye that work iniquity.
The institution itself is equated with iniquity.
Exactly.
So what does this all mean for the person listening right now? We went from discussing mathematical equations, ancient Roman history, the printing press, and 16th century global expansion.
To suddenly standing in a room with a blaring fire alarm.
Yes, it completely changes the dynamic. It's like being in an escape room where you've been casually solving intricate puzzles for an hour, admiring how clever the room designer is, and then suddenly the clock on the wall clicks to 0, a klaxon starts wailing, and the doors lock.
The stakes jump from intellectual to existential in a matter of seconds.
And that jump is the emotional and structural climax of the source material.
The forensic prophetic model isn't meant to be a passive history lesson. It is an activation protocol.
The author genuinely believes that the forensic mathematical alignment of these dates, the 103 AD anchor, the 1474 open door, the 1957 system pivot, and the 2028 conclusion, it proves beyond a shadow of a doubt that this timeline is real.
Therefore, the rejection of the modern system isn't framed as a historical preference or a lifestyle choice.
It's a life-or-death spiritual mandate.
You have to detach from the institutional grid before the final gear stops turning.
Wow. Okay, let's take a breath and recap the massive journey this model has taken us on today.
It's been a lot.
We started with that foundational kinetic trigger in 33 AD, exploring the 70-year mainspring of the pure apostolic era that caught the gear perfectly in 103 AD.
Right.
We watched the model shift into those massive 483-year gears, tracking the rise of the system wrap through the Dark Ages, where the worldly institutions suffocated the decentralized faith.
We examined the controversial math that bridged the gap.
Yes, that bridging math to the incredible paradigm shift in 1474, when the printing press kicked open the door for the written word, decentralizing power for nearly 500 years.
And finally, we explored the shocking pivot in 1957.
Where the advent of mass television broadcasts birthed the visual system grid, leading to a lukewarm corporate faith that the model claims is ticking down to its absolute conclusion in 2028.
It is a staggering, encompassing, and frankly intimidating way to look at human history.
It truly is. It forces you to re-examine the historical events you normally just take for granted.
And as we wrap up, I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over, one that builds directly on the themes of the sources we've discussed today, but applies to your life right now.
Let's hear it.
We've seen how the model heavily emphasizes the medium of communication. The written word era of 1474 democratized faith, putting it in the hands of the individual.
Right.
The visual system grid era of 1957 institutionalized it again, turning it into a massive, passive media spectacle.
And now we live in an era of algorithmic feeds and artificial intelligence.
Exactly. So if we are indeed at the end of a 70-year cycle, counting down to 2028, what happens to human belief structures if that massive institutional grid collapses entirely?
Oh, wow.
What entirely new medium of understanding might define the next gear of human history? Will we return to the decentralized word, or will we build an even more inescapable system?
That is a fascinating question to sit with, especially the next time you open a book or scroll through a feed.
Yeah.
And on that note, we're going to wrap up this deep dive. Thank you so much for joining us on this intense journey through history, math, media theory, and forensic prophecy.
Thanks for listening.
As always, stay curious, keep looking for the patterns, and keep questioning the systems around you.